Hi all, welcome back to my channel, Lisa Does History. I'm Lisa. Today, we're going to be talking about this lady, Josephine Peary, or Jo as she was known. When we consider polar explorers, the ones we think of from books, the names that come to mind are Scott, Amundsen, Douglas Mawson, Shackleton. They're all predominantly male. However, behind one of the most renowned Arctic explorers, Robert Peary, who's credited with allegedly reaching the North Pole first, stood a woman whose courage surpassed his own and even matched it at times, and her name was Jo Peary. Now, Jo was born in 1863 in Maryland in America. She was called Josephine Diebitsch, and she was no ordinary woman. She was a valedictorian, a government clerk, and later an Arctic explorer in her own right. She married Robert Peary in 1888, and instead of staying behind like the average 19th century wife, she packed her furs and followed him north. And this was to be the first of 4 expeditions she would accompany him on over the next 14 years. Jo later told her daughter, "I felt that my place was at his side. As long as I was not a hindrance, I wanted to be with him." It is possible that one reason for her going north with Peary straight after the marriage was to get away from her mother-in-law, who lived with them and who even came with them on their honeymoon. In 1891, Josephine boarded the Kite and sailed to Greenland. The expedition's aim was to figure out if Greenland was an island. She endured months of darkness and isolation, sub-zero temperatures, and she wrote all about it in her book, which was later published. Despite being made to feel not entirely welcome by the all-male crew, who were resentful to have left behind their sweethearts, and they saw the woman on board as a bit of a burden, Jo made the best of it. The expedition quarters in Greenland were made as homely as possible by Jo, and she ensured that the crew's birthdays were celebrated on time and that new members to the expedition party were welcomed. Jo realised that the success of the expedition would rely on working with local Inuit, who found her as quite exotic, just as much as she found them exotic, I'm sure. One elderly Inuit woman said, "I have lived many suns and I've never seen anything like you." So Jo really came into her own when Peary left to trek north on his surveying task with 100 days' worth of provisions. She was left behind at expedition quarters with one resentful crewmate. Jo began to take walks out and about in her husband's absence to avoid this resentful crewmate, and she learned how to handle herself in the wilderness. She could now hunt, and once her husband triumphantly returned, having made the extraordinary journey to the northeast corner of Greenland, they celebrated their 4th wedding anniversary with a dinner made up from 2 deer that she had shot. And then she capped this off by shooting a narwhal and claiming its horn, which she wrote down as stating it was as straight as an arrow and almost as sharp as a stiletto. In 1893, Jo gave birth to her daughter Marie, just 13 degrees from the North Pole. Inuit travelled from hundreds of miles to see Marie to make sure that she wasn't made out of snow, as some of them said they believed. She was nicknamed the Snow Baby. She was also actually nicknamed Anahito to honour the Inuit woman who made her the first snowsuit, and you can see that in this picture here, looking very cute. Although Robert Peary wrote romantically about Marie's arrival in his diary, stating the baby was a little blue-eyed snowflake, Jo's writing presented quite a different picture. She said, "The baby's doing well, but Bert takes no stock of her at all," and Bert was Robert Peary. Peary started to avoid his daughter, causing Jo to worry what would become of the baby if something happened to her. When a huge wave swamped the camp, Peary packed his wife and baby daughter back off home to America. And Jo was not happy to return to Washington and a pile of bills. Peary had left her in dire financial straits, and there was not enough money to bring Peary himself home once his expedition had finished. She was well aware that her place in Peary's life was 3rd, with fame and his mother coming in 1st and 2nd place. Jo managed to campaign to raise the money to bring her husband home. She even got over her fear of public speaking and gave talks to great reviews. She raised $2,000 in one evening after addressing the National Geographic Society, and with this she managed to finally send a ship called the Falcon to successfully rescue her husband in 1895. During the mid-1890s, Robert Peary became fixated on a massive meteorite he'd encountered in Greenland, part of what is now known as the Cape York meteorite. Revered by the local Inuit as sacred and culturally significant, the meteorite held immense spiritual value. Nevertheless, in 1897, Peary orchestrated the removal of this meteorite and transported it back to the United States. This feat showcased both his own engineering prowess and a complete disregard for indigenous beliefs. Peary and his wife Josephine shared a paternalistic view of the Inuit people, which was a perspective common amongst Westerners of their time. They perceived Inuit culture through a colonial lens, often describing them as childlike, and this troubling mindset was evident when Peary brought 6 Inuit individuals, including children, back to New York for an anthropological study. Tragically, neither he nor Josephine ensured proper care for their well-being in the unfamiliar and disease-ridden environment of New York. Within a year, 4 of them had died from illnesses. By 1900, Robert Peary was fully consumed by his quest to reach the North Pole, and once again Josephine found herself left behind in America, facing the burdens of family life alone. She'd given birth to their second daughter, Francine, who tragically died at 7 months of age, and Peary, who was still away on expedition, never met his youngest child. In July 1900, Joe and Marie sailed to Greenland. After a tumultuous journey over some really difficult seas, Joe and her daughter made it to the north. Here she discovered that her husband wasn't in the camp where she expected him to be. He was further north. And Joe and her daughter had no choice but to overwinter on the boat, which was now stuck in ice. Inuit came aboard, and then Joe further discovered that her husband had fathered a child with an Inuit woman who was barely out of her teens, named Alakasina. Joe poured her feelings out into her 26-page letter, which remarkably still exists, and she questions the point of her love and devotion whilst Peary had been away. Remarkably, Josephine Peary stepped in to nurse Alakasina when the young Inuit mother fell ill. Knowing that Alakasina's infant son depended entirely on her survival, Josephine faced a harrowing cultural custom. In cases where the nursing mother died, the child was sometimes strangled. Josephine persuaded the other Inuit on board to promise that the boy would be spared if Alakasina passed away, but she survived. She went on to bear 3 more children, and one of these would again be Peary's. Not judging. On the 6th of May 1901, Peary's 46th birthday, Joe, Marie and Peary were reunited aboard the ship after 3 long years. Another ship arrived called the Eric, and this carried Frederick Cook. He was the doctor who would become Peary's rival for the North Pole. Cook noted the poor physical condition Peary was in. He's an Iron Man, racked in ambition, racked in physique and racked in hope, and he told Peary as much. Joe told Peary he needed to come home to America and recover and look after himself. But perhaps the meeting with Cook had wound him up and he chose to stay, and he waved his wife and daughter off on the Eric. Eventually he did come home a despondent and ailing man. Despite all of this, and despite the fact he'd now lost all his toes to frostbite, Peary lobbied his powerful friends and he managed to get funding for another trip to try and bag the North Pole for the USA. Joe had to release her husband again, and her daughter Marie was furious, asking him to stay. By this time, Joe had also given birth to a son and was beginning to wonder where this marriage was headed, writing to Peary a letter saying, "The sooner we make up our minds that we must each go our own way, the better it will be for us." But Peary was maniacally possessed by the Arctic and pressed on, leaving the US in 1905 for the Arctic once again. He reached a new furthest north of 87 degrees, and then he limped back to Joe, who was patiently waiting for him. In 1908, spurred on by the thought that Cook was advancing on the North Pole, Peary headed off again. He kept notes on this journey of how he would deal with the fame once he'd returned. He was relishing the thought he would be properly famous once he'd nailed the North Pole. Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole on April 6, 1909, accompanied by Matthew Henson and 4 Inuit men. He was celebrated as a national hero at this time, and for decades his achievement was largely accepted. However, later scrutiny, including navigational inconsistencies in his records and the absence of clear corroborating evidence, has sparked serious doubt. Some experts believe he may have fallen short by as much as 30 to 60 miles. So yes, Peary claimed to have reached the pole, and it shaped his legacy. But whether he actually stood on the precise geographic North Pole, that remains unresolved. The drama deepened when Frederick Cook publicly announced that he had reached the North Pole, a claim that ignited fierce debate and cast a long shadow over Peary's own expedition. The controversy rippled through the scientific circles and headlines alike. But for Josephine Peary, the impact was far more personal. As the wife of a man whose life had been defined by polar ambition, Jo found herself caught in the storm, fending off reporters, protecting her husband's reputation, and enduring the psychological strain of uncertainty. The Peary family retreated to Eagle Island off the coast of Maine. It became their refuge, a windswept sanctuary where Jo could focus on family and Peary could wrestle with the legacy he'd chased across the ice for all those years. Robert Peary was now physically diminished and emotionally worn, and he began shifting from exploration to reflection. He spent his time writing and defending his North Pole claim, which continued to face public scrutiny. His identity, so deeply tethered to conquest, now turned inward and fixated on legacy. And Josephine, meanwhile, took on the quiet and powerful role of caretaker and chronicler. She promoted Robert's achievements through lectures and publications. She raised Marie and the son, and they managed the home. Their life on Eagle Island became a blend of domesticity and historical preservation, with Jo helping curate Peary's story for the world, and sometimes she smoothed over the contradictions and the controversies. In 1911, Robert officially retired from the Navy as Rear Admiral, and the couple lived out their days largely on the island, visited sometimes by admirers and journalists. Then Peary died in 1920. He left behind a disputed legacy and a woman who had braved the Arctic, and they'd been married for 32 years. But Jo went on and lived another 34 years, championing Arctic exploration and redefining what it was to be an explorer's wife, because she had been an explorer herself. In 1955, aged 92, and a few months before her death, Jo was awarded the National Geographic Society's Medal of Achievement. And Josephine Peary, she wasn't just the wife of an explorer, she was a pioneer, a writer, a mother, a woman who carved her own path. She took care to give a different perspective in her writings. She illuminated domestic accounts, which are normally absent from male polar accounts. If you're interested, I would recommend this book, Heart of the Hero. This is by Carrie Herbert, and it's all the stories of the women who were behind the Arctic explorers and the Antarctic explorers that we know and love and are slightly obsessed about. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.